here lying to you about it.
You gonna set the record straight?
Are you kidding me? You let Ricky Smiley sit here and you say...
Two names, two legacies, and one question that refuses to go away. When you hear Katt Williams and Eddie Murphy in the same sentence, you're not just talking about comedians. You're talking about two completely different eras of stand-up colliding in a way that forces people to pay attention. These are not internet personalities trying to go viral, not rising comics chasing headlines, but figures who have already done everything there is to do in comedy. They've filled arenas, shaped culture, influenced generations, and built reputations that don't depend on trending topics or algorithm boosts. So when both of them, in their own ways, start pointing toward Kevin Hart, not with loud accusations at first, but with subtle shifts in tone, carefully chosen words, and moments that feel small until you actually sit with them, it creates a kind of tension that doesn't just fade away. It lingers, it grows, and it makes people start asking questions they weren't asking before. Because here's the thing about perception in Hollywood. It's rarely built overnight. Kevin Hart didn't just wake up one day and become one of the biggest names in entertainment. His image was constructed over years, brick by brick, story by story, performance by performance, until it became something almost untouchable. The narrative is familiar to anyone who has followed his journey. A young guy from Philadelphia, grinding through small comedy clubs, bombing on stage, learning timing the hard way, slowly building confidence, slowly building an audience, until eventually the world had no choice but to notice. It's the kind of story that people love because it feels honest, it feels earned, it feels like proof that persistence actually leads somewhere. And for a long time, nobody really questioned it. But what happens when people who were already at the top before that story even began start looking at it differently? What happens when someone like Eddie Murphy, who defined an entire era of comedy before Kevin Hart ever stepped on stage, casually dismisses a claim that has become central to Kevin's brand? It wasn't loud, it wasn't aggressive, it wasn't framed as an attack. It was almost effortless. A simple response, delivered with a calm expression, the kind of tone that doesn't need emphasis because the meaning sits right beneath the surface. When asked about records being broken, Eddie didn't validate the idea, didn't acknowledge it in the way most people expected. Instead, he questioned it. And that question, simple as it sounded, carried weight. Because Eddie Murphy isn't just another voice in the conversation, he's a reference point. When he speaks, especially about stand-up, he's speaking from a place that very few people can relate to. His specials, his timing, his cultural impact, those aren't things that can be easily measured or replaced. So when he looks at a narrative and subtly pushes back against it, it doesn't feel like jealousy. It doesn't feel like competition. It feels like perspective. The kind of perspective that comes from having seen how the industry actually works, how careers are built, how stories are shaped, and how public perception can sometimes drift away from reality. And then there's Katt Williams, whose approach is almost the opposite in style but similar in impact. Where Eddie is measured and controlled, Katt is detailed and direct. When he sat down on Club Shay with Shannon Sharpe, he didn't just throw out vague criticisms or emotional reactions. He presented something that felt structured, almost like he had been holding on to these points for years, waiting for the right moment to lay them out. He talked about timelines, about opportunities, about how certain doors open in this industry and who gets access to them. And whether people agreed with him or not, what stood out was the specificity. It didn't sound random, it sounded intentional. What makes this situation different from typical celebrity drama is that it doesn't rely on a single moment. It's not one comment, one clip, one headline. It's a series of moments that, when placed next to each other, start to form a pattern. Eddie Murphy's quiet skepticism, Katt Williams' detailed breakdown, and Kevin Hart's continued silence on certain topics all exist separately, but together they create something that feels bigger than any one piece. And that's where the conversation starts to shift from entertainment to something more analytical, almost like people are trying to solve a puzzle rather than just react to a story. Because if you strip everything down to its core, the real question isn't about talent. Very few people would argue that Kevin Hart isn't talented. His energy, his delivery, his ability to connect with audiences, those are real qualities that can't be manufactured. The question isn't even about work ethic. By most accounts, Kevin is one of the hardest working figures in the industry, constantly moving, constantly producing, constantly expanding his reach. The question that keeps coming up, the one that sits underneath everything else, is about the story itself, the origin story, the version of events that has been presented to the public for years. Because in any field, especially in entertainment, the story matters almost as much as the work. People don't just buy tickets to a show or watch a movie because it's good. They connect with the person behind it. They invest in the journey, the struggle, the idea that they're watching someone who came from nothing build something meaningful. And when that story is consistent, when it aligns with what people see, it strengthens the connection. But when parts of that story start to feel unclear, or when different versions begin to circulate, it creates a kind of tension that doesn't go away easily. That tension becomes even more noticeable when you look at how information spreads now compared to even a decade ago. Conversations that used to stay in small circles among comedians, industry insiders, or people who were directly involved now reach millions almost instantly. A single interview can shift the entire narrative, not because it proves anything definitively, but because it introduces new questions. And once those questions are out there, they don't just disappear. They get repeated, analyzed, debated, and sometimes expanded in ways that go beyond the original context. But at the same time, it's important to recognize that not every claim, not every interpretation carries the same weight. There's a difference between what is confirmed, what is alleged, and what is assumed. And in situations like this, those lines can blur quickly, especially when multiple narratives are being discussed at once. Some people see Katt Williams' comments as a long overdue truth being spoken openly. Others see them as one perspective among many, shaped by personal experiences and opinions. Similarly, Eddie Murphy's remarks can be interpreted in different ways depending on how you view the context. What makes this conversation particularly complex is that it sits at the intersection of perception and reality. On one hand, you have a public image that has been carefully built and widely accepted. On the other hand, you have voices that are questioning aspects of that image, not necessarily dismantling it completely, but introducing enough uncertainty to make people reconsider what they thought they knew. And that space between certainty and doubt is where most of the conversation is happening. Kevin Hart's response, or lack of response, also plays a role in shaping how this unfolds. In a media environment where people are used to immediate reactions, statements, and clarifications, silence can feel significant. It can be interpreted in multiple ways, as strategic, as cautious, or simply as a decision not to engage. But regardless of the reason, that silence becomes part of the narrative. It adds another layer to the conversation, another element for people to analyze. And this is where the broader implications start to come into focus. Because beyond the individuals involved, this situation reflects something about how success is perceived and understood in the entertainment industry. It raises questions about how stories are constructed, how opportunities are distributed, and how much of what the public sees is shaped by factors that aren't immediately visible. These aren't new questions, but moments like this bring them back into the spotlight in a way that feels more immediate and more relevant. In the end, what you're left with isn't a clear answer, but a set of perspectives that don't fully align. You have one version of events that has been widely accepted for years, supported by visible success and consistent messaging. You have another version that challenges parts of that narrative, supported by individuals who have their own credibility and experience. And somewhere in between, you have the audience, trying to make sense of it all, deciding what they believe, what they question, and what they choose to take from the conversation. And maybe that's the most important part of all of this. Not whether one side is completely right or completely wrong, but the fact that the conversation exists at all. Because once people start asking questions, once they begin to look beyond the surface and consider multiple perspectives, the way they engage with these stories changes. It becomes less about accepting a single narrative and more about understanding the complexity behind it. So when you hear names like Katt Williams and Eddie Murphy connected to a discussion about Kevin Hart, it's not just about three individuals, it's about what they represent, the different paths they've taken, the different ways they've experienced the industry, and how those experiences shape the way they see things. And as long as those perspectives continue to intersect, the conversation isn't going anywhere. It will keep evolving, keep expanding, and keep giving people new angles to consider long after the original moment has passed.